Just doing a really spontaneous, relaxed conversation here on YouNow. If you guys don't know, I broadcast on YouNow from time to time, partly because of the very real loneliness of my life in China. Although being a vegan in Canada was lonely as hell too, and I've talked about that plenty on this YouTube channel. But anyway, one of the questions was about coping with loneliness here in Asia. And I talked for a while about the fact that in many ways, I deal with loneliness in Asia that other people can't imagine. And that's because the type of loneliness you're locked into here, the language barrier is so crucial. It's so important to everything day by day in your life. Can't complain, but I mentioned this, like back when I was living in Laos, there'd be long periods of time when I never had a meaningful conversation in English. I can't say I wasn't speaking English at all, because, you could go to the pharmacy or you could go to the post office and they'd have a worker there who spoke some English, and you'd say, I send this letter to Canada or something. You'd say a few words in English like that, but where you're not having any conversations in English. Even though, I was learning the Lao language and speaking Lao, there are limits to how meaningful those interactions are going to be. So obviously here in China, that's a reality. And now apparently I'm moving from Kunming, the big city, out to the border with Myanmar, a very ethnically diverse area where people speak 5 different languages, but none of them are English. So my ability to communicate with other people, even though I am gregarious, I am personable, I am self-confident, I'm not a shy person. I have no problem sparking up conversations with people. And you guys have heard me tell stories about the gym. Everybody at the gym knows me. You know what I mean? It's cool. But what are you going to talk about in Chinese? I can say this. Everybody at the gym knows me, but there's another sense in which they'll never know me, right? Because of the language barrier. So the loneliness I live with and that I've grown accustomed to living with in Asia is acute. And it would drive some people crazy. And I've met people who are driven crazy. But I've met people who, one of the common ways to respond is alcoholism, drinking alcohol to cope with the loneliness, that kind of thing. But you see people who one way or another go nuts. And often, they're the guys, they're white men who marry Asian women. But then after they get married, they realize how isolated they are. And again, they can talk to their wives about some topics to some extent, but maybe, on a more philosophical level, there are things they can never discuss with their wife. Anyway, I've met all types. I've met all sorts and all variations. But I do cope pretty well with loneliness. And then there was a next question. Following up, someone said, well, do you reject people? Do you refuse to become friends with people because they eat meat, because they're not vegan? And that came because I mentioned in passing, there are some people who refuse to be my friend, who hate me, who dislike me because I'm vegan. I don't even complain. I can see it from their perspective. It's rational. I disagree with it, but it's rational. There are people for whom meat and alcohol are 9/10 of what they do in their spare time. When they're at work, that's one thing. But their free time is devoted to the consumption of meat and alcohol. And there are other people for whom it's, meat and marijuana or whatever. But there are people for whom, culturally and personally and in so many ways, it's a big part of their identity. It's fruit in a can. So do I reject people as my friends or possible friends because they eat meat, because they're not vegan? Having mentioned that there are some people who reject me for that reason, and I can see it from their perspective. I think, the realist answer you can give here is you shouldn't have a policy on this. I don't think anyone should set down a rule in their lives and say, I'm never going to make friends with people unless they meet these criteria. I think you've got to take it on a case-by-case basis. But, on that case-by-case basis, sometimes it's decisive, but normally it's because of what it tells me about the person's other attitudes towards life. It's the way in which they're anti-vegan. It's not just the fact that they're anti-vegan. Because remember, I used to do humanitarian work, so I'd meet other people who were in very obvious ways making the world a better place. To give a corny example, you meet someone whose job is literally going into hospitals and saving lives. I'm really thinking of someone who actually worked in hospital equipment. That actually does save lives, though. It's not like you're saving lives with your hands, but your hands are installing the equipment. In a third world country, to be that kind of specialist. You meet people doing all kinds of, people handing out sacks of rice to starving people, whatever. So you can meet people who are doing good things with their lives in an obvious way, but they're killing cows and pigs and chickens every day without thinking about it, without giving a damn. So I bet a lot of those people. And I can't say that the meat eating was ever decisive, but often when it came up and you saw their rationale for why they ate meat or for why they were disparaging and insulting towards vegans, that told you a lot about who they were. And then for that reason, it's like, I'm not going to lift a finger to make this friendship happen. So recently, it was a little bit touching to me. I met a completely unplanned meeting. I bumped into a guy. But it was an unplanned meeting, but I was in a part of town where he hung out. I bumped into a guy who I knew here in Kunming 9 years ago. And he is a white man living in China who is struggling with that loneliness that I was describing at the top of this video. And he was 9 years ago, and he's still struggling with that loneliness now. Now, it's not that he doesn't talk to people. He talks to people every day. He talks to people at work. He talks to people all the time. He knows a whole circle of other white men who speak English here in Kunming, and he has friends and colleagues, and, he does have a certain social circle. But again, a lot of those interactions are very limited because of the language barrier. And then on the other hand, some of them are limited for political reasons, which I can really sympathize with. So he was actually complaining to me. Believe me, I can sympathize with this. He was saying that, the other white guys here, who are, again, they're white people I knew here 9 years ago. It's amazing. A lot of them are losers. For a lot of them, this part of China is a dead end where they came to curl up and die. And for me, it's not. And the difference in how you live your life is subtle. But you can even see that within the Western world. You can go to Florida. For some people, Florida is where they go to die. And for some people, it's where they go to live. And some people move to Florida with a lot of ambition and wanting to make something happen. And some people go there with absolutely no ambition and absolutely no vision for the future and no purpose. And they sink down into it. So same thing with a place like China, a place like Thailand, what have you. It's 40% real fruit. So this guy, this particular example of a guy for whom this is where he's going to fade away, frankly, he was really, really eager to be my friend, or to be my friend again, because I knew him 9 years ago. And what he had to say about veganism and vegetarianism was very contemptuous and very dismissive and very insulting. And the reasoning behind it, and the type of excuse making, and the type of justification there, that showed something about his character. And now, because I knew him 9 years ago, I also know that he is a white man who very regularly, sleeps with prostitutes, who pays money to have sex with Chinese women in brothels. And I know that he has excuses and rationalizations and conflicted feelings and emotions. And I know that he's a white man who at one time had aspirations intellectually to be a published author, to be important, to be accomplished, to be an historian. And he has excuses for why he has made so little effort, for why he's made so little progress in the last, say, 20 years in that direction. So, the type of excuse making that's tied to what he said to me about veganism. Even though what he said to me about veganism was in some ways mean-spirited, it's not, in his case, it wasn't really what was the mean-spirited element that spoke to me. I just sat there and listened to him, what he had to say about veganism. And it was like, I'm never going to talk to you again. That's always that. I didn't say that to him. That was what I was thinking. And I think he could see it in my eyes. I wasn't angry. My expression didn't change. But, at the end of the conversation, he really said to me, and he sent me an email afterwards saying, look, I hope we can be friends again. He's so desperate to talk to someone else who's a real intellectual, someone who cares about history, someone who cares about politics, and someone who doesn't have the kind of political differences from him that other people have here, someone who's not an extremist in politics or what have you. And, in some ways I can relate, and in some ways I can sympathize, but we also have to make those judgments. Who are we going to make time for? Who are we going to open up the doors to? Who are we going to trust? Who are we going to involve in our lives? And, buddy, it ain't you. It ain't him. So, there have been other people. I remember, I won't even say who, there was one old man, and he just said he agreed with veganism completely in principle. but he couldn't do it because he was too old to change his ways. And we had several conversations. I felt we had no conflict. In that case, it was just real. He just basically said, yeah, veganism is correct. I remember he described it as beautiful. He said it was a beautiful way to live and it was morally correct. But he said, I'm too old now and I can't do it. Real talk. Now, I did talk to him more than about that. I got his perspective a little bit. And it was interesting. He was really morally opposed to sport fishing. Like, there were some really peculiar examples of animal that really spoke to him. Like, fly fishing, this hobby. Like, he really felt that was deeply immoral. I was like, okay. It was just interesting. Like, idiosyncratically, there were different elements of animal rights that he really cared about. You heard his perspective. But that was his real answer. So I didn't feel I had any great conflict with him. And again, that tells you something about his character. So do I have some kind of simple policy like, no, you and me can't be friends, we're never going to be cool because you're not vegan? No. And of course, a lot of people who become my friends, they become vegan or they become reducitarian because they know me, which is a beautiful part of my life. But on a case-by-case basis, sometimes when people talk you through that, why it is they're not vegan, or why they ridicule veganism, I think that really does link to other ugly elements of their character and reasons why maybe you two should not be friends, why you should not open the door to them. And again, with friendship, you are opening the door to them. They could have a really negative impact on your life too.